All right. So before we get started, a couple things, housekeeping things get out of the way. Um, First of all, I had some questions. Although if you watched the recording or were here live, remember the only thing that was due before we started class today was the Module 6 reading. Before we start class tomorrow, that Module 7 reading is due. I put up under the assignments Module 5's reading. Looks like it has a due date. You should be able to access this now from Top Hat to actually read through Module 5 if you want to. We covered it pretty quickly in class. So really Module 6 is going to be the focus there, which is why that was the only assignment that was due before we started class today. I'll kind of have this Module 8 set to release as soon as I get back to my office after class today. That'll be due before we start class on Friday. So that should kind of cover the module readings. That information should be also in this announcement on Canvas. Don't forget that participation quiz from yesterday has that respond us lockdown. So you might have to download that if you don't already have that downloaded to your device. I want to make sure we can kind of have that working for the exam next week. All the other participation quizzes won't have that lockdown browser. It's just the one from yesterday, to make sure we kind of have it working. So all the participation quizzes from this week, as well as the Module 5 and 6 quiz, which will be set to release as soon as we're done with class today. And then Module 7's quiz, which I don't have up here yet, that'll be posted after class on Thursday. So those two quizzes and all the participation quizzes due at the end of the day on Sunday. So you kind of give you some of that flexibility. We will then cover Module 8 on Friday, and then next Monday we'll finish it. You'll have the Module 8 quiz. We'll do Module 9 on Tuesday, Wednesday. You'll have the Module 9 quiz. Those two quizzes will be due by the end of the day next Thursday, because we'll have the next exam already next Friday. So things move quickly in these summer courses. Trying to kind of give you a bit of a roadmap for where we're going. Okay. Also, my other section, I'm going to try to look at this before I post it after class. This quiz, for some reason, the default grade is setting to not be missing. It sets to 0. I don't know why, because I can't find any difference with that in the other quizzes. So if for whatever reason it shows up as a 0 in the grade book, as soon as you complete the quiz, it should replace your grade. So just because you see the 0 in that grade book, you still have one attempt at that quiz. It's kind of giving you guys worst case scenario. I will try to get that changed. So hopefully for your section, I can get that so it's changing the default grade to just missing until after that due date is passed. But I just wanted to kind of mention that just in case you do see a 0 pop up there in the grade book and you haven't taken that quiz yet, that grade, that 0 will be replaced once you take it. Okay. Like I said, hopefully that's not an issue and I can figure out why it's doing that and it didn't do it for the other quizzes, because I have the exact same settings, but it's being finicky. Right? All right. I think that should cover it. Oh, I will also put up under the Files tab. So I'll put up, just like we had the exam 1 materials, I'll put up an exam 2 materials and get the next practice exam up there. I didn't want to post it and have anyone freak out thinking maybe the exam was this week. So I want to be able to mention it in a recording before I did that. So you'll see exam 2 materials kind of get posted up here under the Files tab, and then I'll create, kind of similar to what I did for the first one, what looks like an extra module. It just will have the practice problems there. Okay. All right. Any questions from me before we dive into material here today? Okay, so this first thing we're going to talk about is quotas. I'm actually going to not use the slide here, and I'll introduce this idea to you with a drawing. So quotas are going to be a little bit tricky, although I'm not going to ask you the kind of trickier part of them. I just want to kind of show you why they could be. So for us, I think they should be actually relatively easy, given what we talked about with price ceilings and price floors. So let's say I've got my supply curve, my demand curve. Here's my current equilibrium, price and quantity. Okay. So before, we said consumer surplus is this triangle on top, the area above the price that consumers pay, but below the demand curve. Producer surplus, area below the price they receive, but above their supply curve. So if the government comes in, and so these there's products that, maybe we're trying to help. I don't know. I think the example I used in the slides was like the dairy industry. And they come in and say, we don't want the quantity to be too high. We want to try to limit the supply of this good that's out there on the market. And so we're going to set a quantity and say, this is a quota. Now, quotas sometimes are used like in companies, like you need to produce at least this much. A government quota is saying we can't see any more than this quantity on the market. So it's kind of like a limiting factor. So an effective quota, the only type that we're really going to be talking about, is if it's set below whatever the current equilibrium is. So this is going to do a couple things. Well, first of all, what is dead weight loss? So dead weight loss, we said, was the loss of surplus from a movement away from that equilibrium quantity. So if the quantity is now down here after our quota, every unit here, we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market. The difference between the market's marginal costs and the market's marginal benefits would be this area here. Looks very similar to the dead weight loss created by price ceilings and price floors. Okay. We'll calculate the same way. It's the area of a triangle, 1/2 times base times the height. What's a little bit different with quotas is you can think about here, at that quantity, what is the price, the highest price that a consumer would be willing to pay? Well, that would be up here. So kind of the highest price the consumer would be willing to pay is up here. The lowest price the seller would be willing to supply this good at would be down here. So for all the different types of government intervention we talk about today, there's now going to be a difference between the price the consumer pays and the price that the seller receives. So we no longer have like this new price like we did with a price ceiling or floor. We actually kind of have like two prices almost. Now, what will the price of this good be? We know consumers are willing to pay this much. Sellers are willing to supply it for this amount. Well, any range in between would work for both sides. So they're going to barter, they're going to go barter, or they'll, what word am I looking for? Like negotiate, go back and forth. Any price in this range could be a price that they both agree on. Now, typically, what we would think about is usually producers have a little bit more power in the market. And so we would typically see the price be closer to that price the consumer is willing to pay. So I think in the slides, the way I have this depicted, and for the sake of this class, we'll always think about a quota would raise the price up to that highest price that the consumer was willing to pay. So with a quota, generally, it's going to benefit producers. Producer surplus will increase. And in general, where's consumer surplus now going to be? Right here, right? So consumer surplus was this entire triangle before. Now it's going to be a smaller amount. Similar to like a price floor, producer surplus is going to be a little bit higher than it was at the old equilibrium. Now, what can happen is if the producers don't have power and the consumers do, well, instead of the price ending up here at that highest price the consumer is willing to pay, it could end up a little bit closer to the price the seller is willing. And in that case, producer surplus would go down and consumer surplus would actually go up. So we can't really say without any more information what's going to happen to producer and consumer surplus when we have these quotas. But what we can for sure say is that we know that the quantity will be lower and that we are going to have some dead weight loss. And so those are kind of the things we want to know about quotas. In terms of what's happening to producer and consumer surplus, usually producer surplus goes up, but it's not a guarantee, right? We don't really know where the price is going to fall in this market. In this market. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So I have basically that depiction here in the slides as well. Okay. All right. So the next thing we'll talk about for a large majority of the class are different topics related to taxation. So why do we pay taxes, right? Well, the goal is you take the money that's raised from taxes and you pay for things that the public needs, schools, roads. No one person is going to fund a police force if they can't charge people for using it, right? So what are some different types of taxes? Well, if you have ever worked a job, you have to pay an income tax, right? You taxes every year. Companies have to pay payroll taxes. Now, the most common, I think, an easy tax to think about that we all pay is anytime you buy a good, what is also on the bill? Sales tax. Anytime you go to Walmart and buy something, you always have to pay sales tax, every certain amount of cents on every dollar. Right? Now we also have things we'll talk about later on, which is an excise tax. Excise taxes are going to be taxes on specific goods. So this would be something like there's a tobacco tax, right, or an alcohol tax. Now, so what's the goal of a tax? Well, generally we want to raise money, but also think about it. If I'm imposing a tax on something, what am I doing to the cost? I'm increasing the cost. I'm making it more costly for someone. That's likely going to also reduce the quantity. And we'll see this play out when we start to look at the models. But the goal of a tax could be to reduce quantity as well. And then we're also then going to talk about tax incidence. So taxes will end up moving us away from that equilibrium price and quantity. And it's going to hurt both producers and consumers. And then we want to discuss, well, who is it going to hurt more? So we'll talk about how we determine this. But until we can't really do that until we understand a little bit more about how these taxes are working. Okay. So here's a very basic example from taxation that kind of allows us to think about why taxes are going to reduce the quantity from the equilibrium quantity point. I think I had a slight typo in the ones that's posted on Canvas. I'll replace them after class today. So one of these values might look a little bit different if you're kind of following along with the file on Canvas. But let's say we had a used car. David's willing to pay $11,000 for it, right? Up to that amount. Matt has a used car. He's willing to sell it for anything above 10. Well, any price agreed upon in between this range, both of them are okay with. Let's say it's 10,500. Well, David is okay with that. He would have paid 11,000. Matt's okay with that. He would have sold the car for 10. And so this transaction would occur. What if instead there's a 15% sales tax on used cars? I'm just using this to make the numbers kind of nice. It might seem a little bit of a high tax, but if there's a 15% tax on this used car, let's say that Matt agrees to sell this car to David. He's feeling nice for $10,000, right? They don't even negotiate. He knows David will pay up to 11,000, but he's feeling nice. He'll only charge him 10,000. He's okay selling the car at that. Well, if there's now a tax, when he charges David 10,000, the total cost of David is 10,000 plus however much he has to pay in taxes. 10,000 times 0.15 would be 1,500, making the total price he has to pay 11,500, which is above the amount that he was willing to pay. This transaction no longer occurs. Okay, so before the tax, it would have occurred. After the tax, it doesn't. So we can kind of see this is just one example, or one set of numbers where a tax on a product is going to make some of the transactions that used to occur no longer occur. Okay. Any questions? Should just be a kind of basic. I'm just kind of setting us up here. So I think here I've got an example, and we'll walk through this, and then I'll show you what it looks like if it's a little bit different. So I think this is an easier way to think about taxes. So let's say I had a market that was in equilibrium, and here's the equilibrium price. So my producer surplus is the area below price but above the supply curve, consumer below the demand curve but above that price. Let's say I have a tax on the good. So the easiest way to think about taxes is probably taxes on sellers of products. Okay, so I'll draw this out and then we'll kind of jump back to the slides because I think I can point out a few things here. I think sometimes it's helpful to see these built out. So if I tax the producers of a product, I can think about whatever the marginal costs were to those companies before. What have I done at every single quantity? Well, I think in my example, I was looking at cigarettes. So whatever the cost to provide those cigarettes were before, if I put $1 tax on them, my costs have now went up by $1. Or at every quantity, this supply curve has increased by whatever the value of the tax is, right? My marginal cost will be whatever it was before, plus this additional amount. So taxes on producers essentially increase their costs to providing the good. Okay. So if this was the case, my old equilibrium price and quantity were right here. what is the new, what looks like equilibrium, right? Well, the new equilibrium point we can think of as where the new supply curve plus the tax hits demand. This will be the price that we see on the market, or this is the price that the consumer is going to have to hand over to the company. However, the company doesn't get to keep this amount. If I hand over, right, excuse me, $5 for a pack of cigarettes, but there was a $1 tax on them, the amount that I get to keep, I got 5 from the customer, but I have to give $1 to the government, I only get to keep $4, right? Or whatever the consumer pays minus the tax, right? So this price that the consumer pays, excuse me, actually here, I'll do it this way. The price the seller gets to keep is going to be the price the consumer pays minus whatever that tax is. So with taxes, notice, what is that tax going to do to the price that consumers pay? It's going to increase it. What does it do to the price or the amount of money the sellers get to keep? It decreases it. So who is this tax going to hurt? It's going to hurt both producers and consumers. Okay. Our new quantity after the tax is now going to be down here. So similar to quotas, price ceilings, price floors, where is our deadweight loss coming from? It's coming from the fact that we no longer see any of these units being produced and sold in the market. So the difference between our supply and our demand curve, so this is our original supply and demand curve, all of this surplus we are no longer seeing. This would be our deadweight loss. Okay. I can then think about what is consumer surplus here. Well, before it would have been like this entire triangle, and I'll have some visuals in the slides as well. Now, what is the difference between the price that the consumer pays and their marginal benefit or the demand curve? Notice consumer surplus is now a little bit lower. And then where would producer surplus be? Area below the new price that they get to keep, or the amount of money they get to keep, but above their supply curve. So our producer surplus was this entire triangle before. Now it's going to be a smaller amount as well. So we see with a tax, both producer and consumer surplus are going to go down. So what about this rectangle in the middle here? Right? What would that represent? Well, once we have the government get involved, if we have the value of the tax and I multiply that by the quantity that are sold after the tax, this is just going to be what we call government tax revenue. So where would government tax revenue be here? Well, notice, remember, what did I say? What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps? That difference is just the value of the tax. The width of this rectangle is the quantity of the tax. So this rectangle would represent tax revenue. So we now have what is total surplus? Consumer plus producer surplus plus tax revenue. We can kind of think about this as representing our third party now, government surplus. Okay. So with taxes, both producers and consumers are going to be hurt. We'll generate some deadweight loss, but we're also now going to have tax revenue, right? An additional kind of source of surplus here. Okay. So I've got a depiction of this kind of in the slides with some actual numbers. So notice here I had like the equilibrium price. Price the consumer pays is now a little bit higher. The price the seller keeps is now lower, right? So our producer and consumer surplus is lower than it was before, right? Notice both of those have now decreased. We said, what does this rectangle in the middle represent? Well, the height is the value of the tax. The width is the quantity sold after the tax. Multiply those two things by each other, and you've got tax revenue. And then the difference between that supply and demand curve, that represented the total surplus to the market. For all these units that are no longer being sold, we're missing out on all of this surplus, so that would be our deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay, so what if instead we had the tax on the buyers. Right? So it gets a little bit weird to think about this, but if I have taxes on the buyers, so taxes on the producers of a product, we said, what does it look like? If I can get this out here. It looks like a decrease in supply, right? A leftward shift. So what if we have taxes on consumers, right? We actually end up getting the exact same results as if we tax producers of the good. It just operates through a different mechanism, right? So if I tax the consumers, their marginal benefit will be whatever it was before, but now when they buy this good, they have to pay the tax, right? If they're the one paying it. So at every quantity, we would have that their marginal benefit, kind of their total marginal benefit, after we include this new tax expenditure, would actually be, so it's kind of like the demand minus that tax. So taxes on consumers don't have a kind of decrease in supply, they cause a decrease in demand. Well, what's the new kind of price that we see? Here gets a little bit different, like the price on the market would be here. This is the price the seller gets to keep. However, when I hand over a certain amount of money to buy this good, now as the consumer, I also have to pay the value of the tax. So the price to the consumer is now going to be higher. But now when we calculate producer consumer surplus, here's our new quantity, everything's going to look exactly the same, right? So everything, if we have a tax on producers, a tax on consumers, it puts all of those things at the same point. I still have consumer surplus is lower. I have producer surplus is lower. I've got my tax revenue in the middle here, and I've got my deadweight loss. Right? So everything would work exactly the same, no matter if I tax producers or consumers of this product. I generally will give you depictions, and if you're drawing one out for yourself, I think the easier way to think about it is probably a tax on producers, and it ultimately doesn't matter who it's on. You end up with the exact same results, and I'll show you here in our example that the numbers work out to be the same as well. I just think it's a little more intuitive to think about taxes raising the marginal cost of producers as opposed to taxes like reducing the marginal benefit to consumers. But either way, we get the exact same implications. Okay. So with that example we had earlier, that equilibrium price and quantity, starting out with our total surplus being the sum of consumer and producer surplus. If I tax consumers, it's a demand curve decrease, or what looks like a demand curve decrease. Our new price that's paid to the sellers and they get to keep is going to be lower than it was before. However, the total cost to consumers will be this plus the tax. So the price they pay will be higher. We then end up with, well, what's producer surplus? The area below the price they get to keep above the supply curve. Consumer surplus, the area below their demand curve above this new higher price they're paying. So both consumer and producer surplus goes down. What does this rectangle in the middle represent? It's the quantity sold after the tax times what's the difference between the price the sellers receive and the buyers pay? The value of the tax. So that's our tax revenue. And then we still are missing out on those same 250 units. So the same deadweight loss is going to be created. Okay. So it doesn't matter if we tax producers or consumers. If it's the same amount of a tax, or the same value, we would have the exact same results. Okay. Any questions on that before we look at a slightly different way of thinking about this? So I think in this example, I go back to a tax on the producers. So let's think about if I start out, this market's in equilibrium. What is my consumer surplus? We said it's the area above the equilibrium price, below the demand curve, so A, B, and E. C, D, and F, that would represent producer surplus. Add those two together. Total surplus is this entire triangle. After this tax, the price the consumer paid, we said was higher. Well, I don't have my supply curve in there. That's okay. So after that tax, the price the consumer pays is higher. So area A is like what consumers are left with, right? They used to have A, B, and E they're only left with A now. Same kind of idea for producers. They're only left with area D. Tax revenue, right, was this rectangle in the middle. So the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps is the value of the tax times the quantity sold after the tax. B represents tax revenue that used to be consumer surplus. B was consumer surplus, it is now tax revenue. C represents the area that used to be producer surplus that is now tax revenue. So this was kind of like when we had price ceilings and floors, it transferred surplus from producers to consumers. A tax is going to transfer surplus from producers and consumers to the government. And then E and F would represent consumer surplus lost, that's just gone now. F would represent producer surplus that's just lost, or the total of that being our deadweight loss. Okay. So we can kind of break those areas down and thinking about, how were we ending up with this deadweight loss? Where was the surplus from producers and consumers going to? Some of it was going to the government. Some of it was just lost. Okay. Any questions over anything there before we start to talk about tax incidence now? Or at least getting closer to it. So tax incidence really is just who is bearing more of the burden of a tax. Okay. So in our previous examples, we'll actually end up going back and we'll see that I gave you some numbers that work out to be that both the consumers and producers were hurt equally, right? You can think about why. So the old equilibrium was $4. How much did that tax increase? How much consumers had to pay? It went up by 50 cents. Right? How much less did the sellers get to keep? Well, they kept 50 cents less. So kind of that difference between the old equilibrium price and the price the consumers paid and the sellers keep, that was the exact same difference. They were both hurt equally. If instead we want to think about, okay, what if those weren't the same values? Who is going to end up paying more of this tax, right? Well, I can think about what I'm really looking for is the difference between that price the consumer pays and the old equilibrium price, and then the old equilibrium price and the price that sellers keep. Okay. So I could think about it this way. If I've got the difference between the old equilibrium price and the price consumers now pay after the tax, I know that the old equilibrium price, here, what do I want? Minus the price the sellers keep, right? Whichever of these is larger, that's going to be who is bearing more of the burden of that tax. So think about our example where we had like a $1 tax. Let's say this difference was 75 cents, this was 25 cents. What that's telling me is that who is bearing more of the burden of this $1 tax? Consumers, right? So anytime that difference between the price the consumer pays and the old equilibrium price, if that's greater than the difference between the equilibrium price and the price the sellers keep, we would kind of say here, consumers kind of are bearing more of the burden of that tax, right? If we instead had the reverse, well, that means that the change in the price the sellers get to keep is larger. So now this would mean that the producers kind of are bearing more of the burden. More of. So whichever of these is larger, that represents who is paying like a larger proportion of that $1 tax. Okay. So if we go back to our example before, why was I saying they were bearing it evenly or equally? Because there we had the difference between the prices and the old equilibrium price be exactly the same at 50 cents. So they were both kind of paying half this tax. If I instead had an example, like this one, right? And I'll talk about this stuff in a second. Here I had an example where a tax on producers increased the price that consumers pay by what? 75 cents, but it only decreased the price that sellers got to keep by 25 cents. So that difference tells me that sellers are bearing less of the burden. If I were to compute producer and consumer surplus in this example, what I would see is that consumer surplus is going to go down by more than what producer surplus is going to go down by. Okay. So we can kind of use those prices to determine who is bearing more of the burden of the tax. And then I've just got some additional numbers here. If you wanted another example, we could calculate deadweight loss here. We could calculate total tax revenue. But I was really just using this image to kind of highlight a different set of numbers where we could see who's bearing more of the burden. Whoever's new price is further away from the old equilibrium price, if you want to think about it said that way. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep on moving here? Okay. So who is going to bear more of the burden of a tax? We can look at those prices, but the reason why the price might change more for consumers than for producers is related to something we've already talked about, which is elasticity. So the end result is going to be whoever is more inelastic, they're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. So I always use the example, if I have a room full of students, which I usually do, I say if I took my phone right now and I threw it out at the class, if someone who's going to bear the burden of that, well, if someone is very elastic and they respond to that, they can move out of the way. They won't bear the burden. If there's someone out there who's inelastic and they don't move at all, they're going to get hit by my phone. They're going to bear the entire burden of my action. So when we tax goods, it changes the price. Whoever is more responsive to that price can avoid the burden of the tax. Whoever is more inelastic, meaning that they're less responsive, they're going to end up being the one who bears the burden of that tax. Okay. So who's going to bear more of the burden of that tax? Whoever is more inelastic. Right? Now, here we've already talked about, well, if I calculate elasticities, what is being more elastic? That would be something like this example here. So if consumers, or the price elasticity of demand is in absolute terms 3.9, price elasticity of supply is 1.7. Who is more elastic? Well, the larger number is more elastic. They're more responsive. So consumers will avoid the burden of the tax. Whoever is more inelastic, the producers, they bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay. And then if the reverse were true, if demand or consumers were less elastic, right, they have a value closer to zero, well, if I'm less elastic, I'm going to bear the burden. Supply, who is more elastic, they can avoid it. So whoever has the higher elasticity, they can avoid the burden. Whoever has the lower elasticity, they aren't avoiding it. They're bearing more of that burden. Now, notice in both these examples, both supply and demand are elastic in both cases. So it doesn't mean like, if they're both elastic, it doesn't matter. It's who is more elastic, right? So in this case, they're both elastic, but consumers were more elastic. In this case, they're both elastic, but supply or producers were more elastic. Okay. So it doesn't have to be that one is elastic and one is inelastic. They could both be elastic. It's just who is more elastic, and they can avoid the burden. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on this idea? So I've got another way, and we'll use this for some other stuff we talk about, but I think something else that will hammer home this idea about why being more elastic, you can avoid the burden, or why being more inelastic, you bear more of it. So let's think about if I had supply, let's think about the most inelastic, or what we'll end up calling perfectly inelastic demand, right? We said that would be a vertical line. That means that when the price is changing, people keep buying the exact same amount, right? So notice, where would my equilibrium price and quantity be here? If I had a tax, right? And this is where would producer and consumer surplus be? So before, here was my producer surplus. After, or sorry, not after, before, here was my consumer surplus. My blue marker's dying a little bit on me. If I have a tax, right, and we'll just do it on producers here. We said that's kind of like a decrease in my supply curve. Where is the new price that consumers will pay? Up here. Well, how much do the sellers keep? Notice, if demand is perfectly inelastic, the price that sellers keep will be the price the consumer pays minus the tax. It hasn't changed at all. So, producer surplus after that tax is exactly the same. What's happened to consumer surplus after that tax? Well, it's now only this area here, or I'll try to use a different color, up here. So consumer surplus after the tax, it's went down by quite a bit. All of the surplus lost from consumers, this would now represent what? This would be tax revenue, right? So when consumers were perfectly inelastic, they didn't respond at all. Notice the quantity actually doesn't change in the market. Producers aren't hurt at all. Who bears the entire burden of that tax? Consumers. And that's because they were not just more inelastic, they were perfectly inelastic. So another weird outcome of being perfectly inelastic, though, so even though they bear the entire burden, what is dead weight loss in this example? Well, if the quantity stays the same, how much are we losing out on by the units that we're not seeing sold? Well, the same number of units are being sold, we would actually have a dead weight loss of 0. So this is kind of a weird outcome of perfectly inelastic demand, is that there's actually no loss of surplus, and it's just that all of this consumer surplus is transferred over to government revenue or government surplus. So here it highlights, you're perfectly inelastic, you bear the entire burden of that tax. What if instead I was thinking about, I had a supply curve and I had perfectly elastic demand, right? Well, if demand is perfectly elastic, right? Here was my old equilibrium quantity and price. If we see a tax on this good, where is my new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, notice that's going to reduce the quantity, but the price that the consumer pays actually won't change. What price will the seller keep? It's going to be down here. So what was producer surplus before? It would have been the area below price, but above the supply curve. So it was this entire area. After the tax, what is producer surplus? The area below the new price they receive in the supply curve, it's went down by quite a bit. And then in this example, we actually do have a reduction in quantity. So the difference between our supply and demand curve, this would represent dead weight loss. And then all of this tax revenue used to be producer surplus, right? Which is now tax revenue, right? So with perfectly elastic demand, who is going to bear the entire burden of this tax? It's actually going to be suppliers. And it's kind of a weird one. So when demand is perfectly elastic, they're infinitely responsive, they're going to avoid the entire burden. Okay. When they didn't respond at all, they bore the entire burden. Right? So they can avoid it over here. This is kind of a weird one. What would consumer surplus be if you had perfectly elastic demand? So if you had perfectly elastic demand, consumer surplus, the difference between the price and the demand curve, would actually always be 0. Right? So if you're perfectly elastic, your consumer surplus, it didn't change, it stayed at 0. Okay. So using the two extremes to kind of think about this relationship of if you are more inelastic, you bear more of the burden, more elastic, you can avoid the entire burden if you're perfectly elastic. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we'll leave this up as we switch back to the slides. Or I shouldn't say leave it up, but you should be able to still see the video. So we kind of already talked through this. No deadweight loss, etc. Just to put some values to this, some numbers, we can think about different ways of maybe just saying this in a slightly different way. So the old equilibrium price here, and this is the same grid lines we used last class for price ceilings and floors. So let's say the equilibrium price was 50, equilibrium quantity was 40. After the tax, the new price consumers pay will go up to 60. The new price that sellers get to keep will be 40. So first of all, what's the value of the tax here? I'm just looking for the difference at any quantity between the supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax. So the easiest one to do, I could look at the intercepts. The change here at 0 is 20. Also, the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps is also the value of the tax. Well, hopefully that's the same value. Sure enough, it's 20. Okay. So consumer surplus before was the area above the old equilibrium price, but below demand. So that triangle is what? 40 times 40 times a half. Producer surplus was the area below equilibrium price, above supply. That triangle was 40 times 40 times a half. So we started out with producer and consumer surplus at 800. Excuse me. If I look at after the tax, what is consumer surplus now? It's this shaded blue area. So that's going to be what? 30 times the new quantity after the tax is 30. So 30 times a half is 450. Now, without even looking at the values, if I told you the new price that the consumer pays is 60, the price the seller keeps is 40, and the old equilibrium price is 50. What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the old equilibrium? 10. What's the difference between the old equilibrium and the price sellers now keep? 10. So when that difference is the same, that says they're both sharing the burden of this tax equally. We would actually know that the supply and demand must have the exact same elasticity measures here. Not only are they going to have the same elasticity, if they bear the burden of this tax equally, how much is their consumer and producer surplus going to fall by? The exact same amount. So if consumer surplus went down by 450 from this tax, before I even look at the triangle, I can calculate it using the triangle, but I know that producer surplus should also fall by the exact same amount. Sure enough, the new price sellers keep is 40. If I calculate the area of this triangle here, 30 times a half, I get that same $450. Right? All right. I also can determine the tax revenue. That's just going to be the value of the tax, 20, times the quantity sold after the tax, 30. 20 times 30 would give me that tax revenue of 600. So deadweight loss, I can calculate. We might be comfortable now thinking about, okay, it's the surplus lost from all of these units that we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market. So I could look at like this little triangle here, difference between supply and demand for all of these 10 units between 30 and 40. 20 times 10 times a half, I would get 100. What I could also do is think about, well, what does deadweight loss represent? It's the loss of total surplus. What was total surplus before? Well, that was just producer plus consumer surplus. So 1600. What is total surplus after? 450 plus 450, so 900. So wait, so deadweight loss, shouldn't it be 600? Excuse me. Or not 600, 700? Well, no, because after the tax, I have producer and consumer surplus, but I also have government surplus or tax revenue. So there, to find total surplus after the tax, I would need to add up 450 plus 450 plus 600, giving me total surplus of 1,500, which was a $100 reduction from before the tax. Okay. So just putting some values, some numbers to this, thinking about this in a slightly different way. Okay. Where are we at on time? Oh, perfect. So I'll go through this kind of quick. But there's going to be like this trade-off. If I think about like the size of a tax, right? So if I have a small tax here, you know, it's going to change that price. I generate some tax revenue. So it might cause a very small amount of deadweight loss, right? And the reason why is because a small tax won't reduce quantity by very much. Now, as I increase the tax, maybe I can increase tax revenue. So I try to draw this proportionally. This looks like a larger area. But notice that comes at a cost of what? If I increase the tax, that's going to decrease the quantity even more, and I'm going to create even more deadweight loss. So there is a point, and we really won't dive into this too deeply, although you could think about it's going to be similar to when we talked about demand elasticities and tax or total revenue. But notice as I start to create a larger and larger tax, initially I'll start generating more tax revenue, but that deadweight loss starts to grow. If I continue to make a larger and larger tax, well, a very large tax, maybe I'm making like $100 in every unit, but a really large tax decreases the quantity by so much that if I had a tax large enough, what would quantity become? Zero. How much tax revenue am I generating if nothing is sold? $0. So as we increase the size of a tax, there will become a point where we actually start to reduce tax revenue. But always, if we increase the size of the tax, what is always increasing? Deadweight loss. Right? So kind of notice here, if we start out from the smallest tax, moderate tax, largest tax, deadweight loss is always increasing. Tax revenue may not necessarily always increase if I increase the size of a tax. Right? But deadweight loss definitely will. Okay. So some of the summary, just a summary slide of everything we've talked about. Doesn't matter if we tax producers or consumers, if it's the same value, the same amount of tax, it'll have the same implications on surplus, the reduction in quantity, etc. Who bears more of the burden or the incidence of the tax is going to depend on that relationship between the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. If we tax goods that are more inelastic, right, we can generate more tax revenue without kind of suffering deadweight loss. So that was the idea. Perfectly inelastic demand, we actually have no deadweight loss and can generate a lot of tax revenue. So we like to tax things that are inelastic because we can generate a lot of tax revenue without suffering a lot of deadweight loss. And then deadweight loss will increase as the size of the tax increases, and deadweight loss and tax revenue will be a function of the size of tax. Once again, we didn't really dive into this too deep. Kind of the takeaway here is just that there is a trade-off. As I increase the size of a tax, initially I might be increasing tax revenue at the cost of increasing my deadweight loss, but there gets to be a certain size tax where I'm increasing deadweight loss, but I may now also be decreasing tax revenue. If I'm reducing the quantity by too much, having a larger tax may actually decrease the amount of tax revenue I can generate. Okay. So kind of an example of this would be something like in Ireland in 2002. They had this idea that they were going to put a tax on plastic bag use. So what ended up being pretty true is even this really small percent change in the, I guess it shouldn't be a small percent change. It was actually relatively large, right? If plastic bags were free before, but if you had to pay for them, there's now a tax on them. So you think about like when you go shopping, all these plastic bags, they get overused, they all end up in the landfill. So maybe the goal isn't necessarily to generate tax revenues. So another goal of taxes I brought up early on was maybe I just want to reduce the quantity. If that's my goal, then I don't really care as much about deadweight loss, right? Maybe I think that even though the market for plastic bags has deadweight loss, the fact that there's no longer pollution is going to avoid, my entire country is going to avoid the negative costs of that pollution. So this 15-cent tax on plastic bags, they actually saw that plastic bag use fell by 90%. So pretty elastic demand there. People were very responsive to this small change in price. And so if we have very elastic demand, this small change in price reduced the quantity a lot. Well, if I reduce the quantity a lot, what's going to be true? I'm going to end up with a huge dead weight loss. And if people aren't really using plastic bags, even though I'm charging 15 cents for each one, I'm going to have a pretty small amount of tax revenue generated. So I don't know, this is kind of a real world example where, they didn't generate a lot of tax revenue, but this tax, if people were very elastic, it greatly reduced the quantity. And if that was the goal of the government, right, to reduce pollution from plastic bags, they met their goal. Okay. And then we'll talk about externalities. That's kind of our next chapter. So we'll revisit this idea of tax revenues and why it might actually be ideal, even though this did create some deadweight loss, to tax certain goods, okay, if they have negative externalities. So that'll be kind of next week, a little foreshadowing there. Next week, sorry. Next class, a little foreshadowing there, okay? All right, so taxation, right? Cursing, there's only one bad word, taxes. So the next thing that we're going to look through is kind of the reverse of taxes. So a lot of what we've used will apply, but we're going to take a look at subsidies. So I'm going to draw out what I have in the slides, and then if we have time, I'll add something in. But for right now, we just want to think about, if I give people, instead of taxing people for doing something, either producers or consumers, if I give people money for producing or consuming something, what is that going to do to the market? So if we started out with a market in equilibrium, I then give, let's say, producers money for producing something. So maybe this is like electric vehicles, right? There's subsidies on electric vehicles. So whatever my marginal costs were before, if I give you money to produce these, what is that like I've done? It's almost like I've decreased the marginal costs at every quantity. So subsidies to producers, it's almost like you can think about the supply curve plus the subsidy. I'm lowering that company's costs. I'm actually going to see an increase in that supply curve. So taxes, we said it looked like it decreased the supply curve if the tax was on the producers. With a subsidy, it looks like it increases. Okay. So our new, what looks like equilibrium with this subsidy, this is going to represent the price that consumers would be willing to pay, right? So this will kind of be like the price we see in the market, or the price that consumers are now willing to pay at this higher quantity. So notice the subsidy, or the quantity with the subsidy, has actually went up. If I'm giving people money to do something, you would think I would see more of it. The exact opposite of taxes. What is the price that the sellers get to keep? Well, if an electric vehicle costs, I don't know, $50,000, but the government is giving me a $10,000 subsidy, the consumer hands over 50,000, I get an additional $10,000 subsidy. The price that the seller gets to keep is now going to be higher. So with a tax, the price the consumer paid went up, the price the seller kept went down. It's the exact opposite with subsidies. Okay. So as a result, what has happened? Well, before, what was consumer surplus, right? The area above the equilibrium price, but below the demand curve. Here was the consumer surplus before. What is it after? Well, now it's the area above the price consumers pay up to this new higher quantity. Notice consumer surplus after the subsidy is this entire area. So we've seen consumer surplus has went up. Okay. Now, what about producer surplus? Well, before, the old equilibrium price, area above supply curve, here would have been producer surplus before. After the subsidy, the new price sellers keep is up here. So the area below that, but above our supply curve, now not above the supply curve with a subsidy, but above our supply curve, notice producer surplus has also increased. And I know the colors can mix is kind of a weird thing. We'll look at this in the slides of just getting a different depiction of this as well. But you can kind of notice, where does that red and blue area overlap? That surplus is essentially being double counted. We also gained some surplus here and some surplus here. Okay? So initially we might think, oh, okay, producer and consumer surpluses went up. We actually see the quantity is went up as well. Why then will we have deadweight loss with a subsidy? The reason why is because when the government is paying people to do something, we now no longer have a government, tax revenue. We have government expenditures or an additional cost. So what is the total cost of the government going to be from the subsidy? It's the value of the subsidy times the quantity after the subsidy. Very similar to tax revenue. So what is that represented visually in the graph? Well, here's the quantity after the subsidy. The difference between the price the seller keeps and the consumer pays, that was just the value of the subsidy. So this entire rectangle, which was the area that was being double counted, so that will kind of cancel out because now the subsidy is a huge additional cost. This cancels out. The additional gain, well, we had additional cost there as well, so that cancels out. And we're left with this little triangle over here, which is additional costs that aren't canceled out by any additional gains. So we now end up with deadweight loss kind of being this triangle out here. Right? Now this looks like a whole mess. So piecing that together, let's look at this visually in the slides, and I think hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear. Okay. So I've got my initial equilibrium, subsidy to producers. The new price the consumer pays will be lower. The seller gets to keep a higher amount. If we just have deadweight loss in this graph, I'm going to tell you it's this kind of triangle on the right, just like in what I was drawing. Now, the reason why is because with a tax, where was our deadweight loss coming from? With a tax, our deadweight loss was coming from the fact that we were underproducing. There was units that used to have positive surplus that are no longer being produced. That difference between the supply and demand curve for that reduction in quantity. So if we go back here, oh, yeah, we can use one of these, right? The reduction in quantity, we were missing out on all of this surplus. With subsidies, we are now overproducing. So the deadweight loss is going to come from the fact that when we overproduce past that equilibrium quantity, the marginal costs of the units between 15 to 25 are above the marginal benefits. So all of these units from 15 to 25 would have like a negative net benefit to society, or this is going to generate a loss of surplus from the overproduction of a good. So taxes, our deadweight loss comes from the underproduction. Subsidies, our deadweight loss comes from the overproduction. So another way of seeing why this ends up being the deadweight loss, and I gave you the explanation in terms of because it's the difference between the marginal cost and marginal benefits for our overproduced units. But another way of thinking about it is, let's say I started out at the allocated efficient point. I've got producer surplus, this red area, consumer surplus is this blue area. When I have this subsidy, we said the price the consumer pays is now lower. So instead of just this little blue area, it has now went to the entire area under the demand curve up to this new higher quantity and above this new lower price that consumers pay. Producer surplus will be the area below the new price that sellers keep, but above the supply curve. So it's going to be this area here. So notice there is some overlap in those. So that area is getting double counted, but also this area here didn't exist before. So not only is this area in the middle here being double counted, we have this additional gain above and below. The reason why total surplus hasn't increased though is because what is the total government expenditure? It's this entire yellow block, right? So that washes out the gain to producer and consumer surplus, And everything here is only going to be counted once now, right? Because it gets canceled out by the additional expenditure. So what is the change in total surplus? Well, the area that was double counted will still be there, right? We'll still have this, but now the additional expenditure that doesn't get canceled out by anything is going to be this triangle, this green triangle over here. Okay. So that kind of helps solidify, hopefully, like why this is dead weight loss, why we could see both producer and consumer surplus increase, but still have dead weight loss because of this increase in government expenditure. I don't know. I think that animation hopefully kind of helps. It's hard to kind of draw it. Got so many colors, they just start all looking like, kind of blending together. Here's another way, running through those animations of seeing that. Okay. Any questions before we go to the quiz for today? That should kind of round us out. Like I said, I have one more thing if we have time after we get through the questions that I'll add in that I think will help as well. Okay. So, didn't want to stop sharing. I wanted to stop the slideshow and go to that participation quiz. Okay. So if we click on that, I'm going to go to build here. What's this first one, right? So what is producer surplus after a tax is imposed in the market above? Well, first of all, if I didn't tell you the value of this tax, how could I determine what it is? So the difference between our supply curve and our supply curve with the tax, the difference is just the tax. So I could look at the intercepts, goes from 10 to 35. So the difference between those is the value of the tax, or $25. I could also look to see after the tax, the new price consumers pay will be 70. The price the seller gets to keep down here on the supply curve would be 45. The difference between those should be the value of the tax. 70 minus 45 is also that $25 tax. So what will producers' surplus be after this tax? Well, it's going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. What's the marginal benefit? The price that they get to keep, so 45. And what's their marginal cost? Represented by the supply curve. So this triangle on the bottom here. So the height is going to be what? 35 times 35 times a half, because it's a triangle, should give us that 612.50. Okay. I don't think that one's too bad. What if I had the same depiction, but I want to know what is tax revenue? Well, tax revenue, right, is simply going to be the value of that tax, which we said was $25, times the quantity sold after the tax. This new quantity where the supply curve plus the tax hits our demand curve is at 35. So 25 times 35, don't times it by a half because it's the area of a rectangle, right? Also, tax revenue is just the value of the tax times the quantity sold. Right? So 25 times 35 should give us that $875. Okay. Any questions on either of them? I'm going through these kind of quick. I want to save some time for the last two here. Okay. So here, this one's probably a little bit easier. I could calculate deadweight loss. I know that it's going to be the loss of surplus, or the difference between my supply and demand curve, from that reduction in quantity with a tax. Let's say instead I gave you the following information. And let's make sure it lines up with the question. So let's say I told you that the initial equilibrium quantity was, what is it, 40? No, 50. I told you the price that the consumer pays after the tax is 70, and the price the seller gets to keep is only 45. If I asked you just from that information to tell me what deadweight loss is, actually, sorry, I need one more thing. I also tell you the quantity after the tax is 35. Okay. Just given that information, I can determine what deadweight loss is. Why? Because anytime I draw out a tax example, this equilibrium quantity. This will be the quantity after the tax. Here's the new price that consumers pay. Here's the new price that sellers keep. What is deadweight loss? It's the difference between the supply and demand curve, or the marginal cost and marginal benefits to the market, for all those units that are no longer being produced and consumed. So what is the height of this triangle always going to be? The difference between the price that the consumer pays and the seller keeps, or the value of the tax. What is the width of this triangle always going to be? The difference between the quantity and the quantity sold after the tax, or the loss of the number of units. And then it's always going to be a triangle, so we would still need to then multiply it by 1/2. So if I do that here, it's going to be what? 25 times 15 times 1/2, right? So I think this is 187.5, if I'm doing quick math or remembering this problem correctly. 187.5. Sure enough, if I look at this triangle in the graph, the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps, that was 25. This width would always be how many units less are being produced and consumed in the market, 15. It's always a triangle, so times 1/2. I would always end up with that 187.5. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So we're then thinking about subsidies. So which of the following is not true? Okay. So I'll draw a less detailed, so I won't have as many things as we had before. And I'm also going to draw two different ways. So let's say I had my supply and demand curve. I've got my equilibrium price and my equilibrium quantity. I then impose, sorry, we're doing subsidies, not taxes. I want to do a subsidy, and I'm going to give it to the producers. All right, so we said that's going to increase my supply curve, which will lower the price consumers pay, increase the price that the sellers get to keep. So what's going to happen? Well, we said the new consumer surplus, so old consumer surplus was here. The new price they pay is down here, so new consumer surplus is going to be this entire area. So consumer surplus has went up. The quantity that we see sold after a subsidy has also went up. The price that the consumer pays, well, how does consumer surplus go up? The demand curve hasn't changed. So their marginal benefits are whatever they were before. The consumer surplus goes up because the price the consumer pays is now lower. Right? What about producers? Well, before, the area below price but above the supply curve, producer surplus was right here. After the subsidy, the price that sellers keep is going up. Their marginal costs haven't changed at all, but the price being higher, the marginal benefit has. Excuse me. So producer surplus, because of this, is also going up. Okay. So just to kind of shorthand that, if we're thinking about which one is not true, consumer and producer surplus will increase. So this one can't be true. Producer surplus doesn't go down. The price the consumer pays does go down. The price the seller keeps will go up, and then the quantity in the market will also go up. Okay. Any questions on any of the problems there in that quiz? If not, there's still one more thing I want to do that's kind of related to this fourth question.
Could you just go over the first one for me again, please?
Question 1?
Yes.
Yeah, so after you have a tax imposed, if we're looking for producer surplus, the new price that consumers pay after the tax was 70. Sellers only keep 45.
45K.
So producer surplus is the area below that new price sellers keep, but above our supply curve. The height would be 35, base would be 35, 35 times 35 times 1/2 should be that 600.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before I go one more graph here to end class? Okay. So we have this, right? So similar to taxes, everything I've done up to this point, I was showing you a subsidy given to producers. For me, I have always actually thought it makes more sense, subsidies that sinks into my brain more, if I think instead about subsidies given to consumers, right? So this is things like tax write-offs or essentially subsidies, like giving consumers money for having certain products, for owning a home, etc. So if instead I've got, use green here. If I've got a subsidy to consumers, it'll be like their marginal benefit is whatever it was before to owning that good, plus some additional amount given to them by the government. That's going to be true at every single quantity. So just like with taxes, we could think of, you would tax producers or consumers, both of them would look like decreases in supply or demand. You can give subsidies to producers, looks like an increase in supply. You can give subsidies to consumers, looks like an increase in demand. Now, where is that kind of new price going to be? Well, it's up here. It's just now that price will represent, well, this is the point I'm at on the supply curve. So this is the price that the sellers are actually keeping. This is the total value of whatever I'm owning plus the subsidy. So the actual benefit or the actual kind of price that I'm paying, if I take that subsidy out, would be down here. So notice I have the exact same price that consumers pay and price that sellers keep. When I go through and find consumer surplus, the area underneath demand but above the price that consumers pay, that'll be the same. When I find producer surplus, the area below the price that sellers now pay in their supply curve, that'll now be the same. I would still have kind of the same areas in either one of what deadweight loss is. And so it doesn't matter if I give subsidies to consumers or producers, I have the exact same results, right? Oh, and the other one that I didn't add in here, if I give subsidies to consumers, that would also cause that quantity to go up. Okay. Any questions on anything before we kind of end class here? So should be good for the quiz. Like I said, as soon as I get back up to my office here in the next couple minutes, I'll have this quiz be set to release. I'll get the next module 8 reading up there as well you can start working on. And other than that, it should do it. I think I'm going to end the recording here. And then if you have any questions, I'll kind of hang around after the fact.